In the savage wilderness of the Roman Empire, where power was seized through blood and violence, there emerged a figure so monstrous, so utterly terrifying, that even hardened legionnaires whispered his name in fear. Standing over 8 feet tall with the strength to pull an ox cart single-handedly, Maximinus Thrax was not merely an emperor. He was a walking nightmare that would plunge Rome into 50 years of chaos and civil war. This is the story of a shepherd-turned-bandit-turned-emperor, whose reign of terror began the crisis of the 3rd century, and whose dark fate would serve as a brutal reminder that even the mightiest giants can fall. The man who would become known as Maximinus Thrax was born around 172 or 173 CE in the harsh frontier region of Thrace, near the Black Sea. But even his origins are shrouded in controversy and darkness. The ancient sources paint conflicting pictures of his parentage, some claiming he was the son of a Gothic father and an Hellenic mother, others describing him as Thraco-Roman. What remains consistent across all accounts is that he came from the lowest possible station in Roman society. His father was described as a peasant, and young Maximinus himself was allegedly a shepherd who led a band of robbers in his youth, preying on travelers and merchants in the wild borderlands. To the Roman Senate, Maximinus was never truly Roman at all, despite Caracalla's edict granting citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. The Greeks had long viewed Thracians as the original barbarians, fierce and uncivilized people from the edges of the known world. The Romans themselves had a tumultuous relationship with Thrace, engaging in brutal wars since the 4th century BCE. From these conflicts came the image of the Thrax gladiator, a savage fighter armed with a curved sword and small shield, designed to provide bloody entertainment in the arena. This was the stereotype that would forever cling to Maximinus. The barbarian warrior, powerful but crude, dangerous but lacking in refinement. But what truly set Maximinus apart from every other man of his era was his absolutely extraordinary physical presence. Ancient writers described him as surely the largest man ever to hold imperial office, claiming he stood an impossible 8 feet 6 inches tall. While these measurements were likely exaggerated, the consistent descriptions from multiple sources suggest he was genuinely gigantic by ancient standards. The Historia Augusta claims his sandals were twice the size of regular army issue, and that he wore his wife's bracelet as a thumb ring. His appetite was equally legendary, supposedly consuming 40 pounds of meat and 18 bottles of wine at each meal, while avoiding vegetables entirely. Modern historians and medical experts believe Maximinus likely suffered from acromegaly, a condition caused by excessive growth hormone production. This would explain not only his enormous size, but also the detailed descriptions of his appearance: a prominent forehead, large nose, and lantern jaw. The condition would also account for his legendary strength and unusual sweating, reportedly filling 3 vessels daily with perspiration. Some accounts claim he could punch out a horse's teeth with his fist, break a horse's leg with a kick, or crush a man's body with his bare hands. His superhuman strength earned him nicknames like Hercules and Antaeus among the soldiers. Whether these physical descriptions are entirely accurate or represent stylized barbarian stereotypes designed to emphasize his otherness, they capture the profound impression Maximinus made on his contemporaries. He was a man who inspired both admiration and terror, a walking embodiment of raw, primitive power in a world increasingly dominated by political sophistication and administrative complexity. The transformation of this Thracian shepherd into a figure of imperial destiny began with a chance encounter that reads like something from legend. In 202 CE, Emperor Septimius Severus was campaigning in Thrace during his civil war against Pescennius Niger. Severus had established his camp near Perinthus, and as the campaigning season approached, he organized military games to honor his son Gaeta's birthday on March 7th. These games featured contests in wrestling and other martial arts, providing entertainment for the troops and a chance for ambitious young men to catch the emperor's attention. It was at these games that the young Thracian colossus first stepped into the light of history. Barely able to speak Latin, This massive shepherd presented himself before the emperor, requesting permission to compete. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Maximinus proceeded to wrestle 16 of the emperor's burliest soldiers consecutively, defeating them all. Still only slightly winded, he then raced the emperor's horse and won. As if this weren't impressive enough, he went on to overcome 7 more hefty legionnaires in additional contests. The next day, determined to capitalize on his success, Maximinus returned to display even more feats of endurance and strength, wrestling 7 additional challengers and demonstrating abilities that left observers comparing him to legendary figures like Milo of Croton and Hercules. Emperor Severus, genuinely impressed by this display of raw power and determination, awarded him a gold collar and designated him for his personal bodyguard. The Thracian Colossus was inducted into the Roman army on the spot, beginning a military career that would span over 3 decades. Though initially known by his Thracian name, he adopted the Roman name Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus upon entering imperial service. This marked the beginning of his transformation from barbarian shepherd to Roman soldier, though he would never fully shed his reputation as an outsider, a fact that would haunt him throughout his eventual reign as emperor. Maximinus threw himself into military service with the same intense dedication he had shown in those first wrestling matches. His loyalty to Severus and the Severan dynasty became absolute, perhaps because they had given him opportunities he could never have imagined as a shepherd in Thrace. Under Severus, he rose through the ranks with remarkable speed. His combination of physical prowess, fierce loyalty, and natural leadership ability, making him an ideal soldier in an empire that valued military virtue above all else. When Severus died in 211 CE, Maximinus continued to serve faithfully under Caracalla, commanding sentries and distinguishing himself in various campaigns. But the assassination of Caracalla in 217 CE triggered a profound change in Maximinus. He had genuinely revered Caracalla, seeing him as the embodiment of military virtue and imperial strength. The murder of his emperor by the ambitious Praetorian prefect Macrinus filled Maximinus with rage and disgust. Refusing to serve under Macrinus, whom he viewed as a usurper and coward, Maximinus withdrew to a villa in Thrace, effectively retiring from military service. This was a remarkable act of principle for a professional soldier, choosing exile over compromising his loyalty to the Severan dynasty. He remained in this self-imposed retirement throughout Macrinus's brief reign, watching from the sidelines as the empire struggled with the challenges of transition. When the teenage Elagabalus claimed the throne in 218 CE, aligning himself with the Severan dynasty as Caracalla's supposed cousin, Maximinus initially considered returning to service. He presented himself before the new emperor, but Elagabalus's notorious behavior and lack of character disgusted the veteran soldier. Once again, Maximinus resolved to retire in disgust, preferring obscurity to serving under an emperor he could not respect. However, some of Elagabalus's advisors recognized the value of keeping such a legendary warrior in imperial service. This intervention kept Maximinus in the military structure, though he remained deeply uncomfortable with Elagabalus's reign. The assassination of Elagabalus in 222 CE and the succession of Alexander Severus brought genuine joy to Maximinus. Alexander, another Severan cousin, represented everything Maximinus admired: discipline, respect for military tradition, and apparent dedication to the empire's welfare. Maximinus hurried to Rome to present himself to the new emperor and was warmly welcomed. Alexander made him tribune of the 4th Legion and gave him soldiers to train as he pleased, recognizing his exceptional abilities as both warrior and leader. Under Alexander Severus, Maximinus reached the pinnacle of his military career. Eventually, the emperor made him commander of the entire Roman army, a position of enormous responsibility and trust. This appointment would prove to be Alexander's undoing, as it placed a man of immense ambition and limited patience with civilian authority in control of Rome's military might. For over a decade, Maximinus served Alexander faithfully, But cracks began to appear in their relationship as the emperor's policies increasingly favored diplomacy over military action. Alexander's approach to governance emphasized negotiation, tribute payments, and administrative efficiency over the direct military confrontation that Maximinus and many soldiers preferred. This philosophical difference would eventually explode into open conflict on the Rhine frontier in 235 CE. The crisis that would transform Maximinus from loyal general to rebel emperor began with Alexander Severus's campaign against Germanic tribes raiding across the Rhine. Roman legions had suffered defeats in previous engagements, and the emperor was simultaneously concerned about threats from the Sassanid Empire in the east. Leading his troops personally, Alexander chose to resort to diplomacy and tribute payments to pacify the Germanic chieftains quickly, rather than pursuing the military conquest that his soldiers expected. According to the historian Herodian, this decision cost Alexander the respect of his troops, who felt that more severe punishment was required for tribes that had intruded on Roman territory. The soldiers saw their emperor's willingness to pay tribute as a sign of weakness, particularly humiliating for men who had dedicated their lives to military service and who viewed negotiation with barbarians as beneath Roman dignity. In early spring 235 CE, Alexander and his mother Julia Mamaea attempted an offensive against the Germans, hoping to resurrect the young emperor's reputation with the army and people of Rome. But when Alexander once again chose to negotiate instead of fight, offering tribute to the Alemanni, the army's fury reached a breaking point. Maximinus, commanding Legio IV Italica composed of recruits from Pannonia, found himself at the center of a growing mutiny. His soldiers, already angered by Alexander's payments to Germanic tribes and his avoidance of decisive military action, began looking to their giant commander as an alternative to their weak emperor. Where Alexander appeared hesitant and diplomatic, Maximinus embodied the stern, awesome military leadership they craved. The soldiers of Legio IV Italica, joined by men from Legio XXV Primigenia, were particularly incensed by what they saw as their emperor's cowardice. These were professional soldiers who had joined the army expecting to fight Rome's enemies, not to watch their commander pay tribute to barbarians. The decision represented everything they despised about civilian leadership's interference in military affairs. The confrontation came to a head near the city of Mainz in modern-day Germany. Alexander's own troops, led by Maximinus's Pannonian recruits, turned against their emperor in a violent mutiny. On March 20th, 235 CE, the soldiers assassinated both Alexander Severus and his mother Julia Mamaea, ending the Severan dynasty that had ruled Rome for over 4 decades. Immediately after the murders, the army proclaimed the giant Maximinus emperor. It was a revolutionary moment in Roman history. For the first time, a man who had never held senatorial rank, who came from the lowest social origins, who was considered by many to be barely Roman at all, had been elevated to the purple by military force alone. The Roman Senate, faced with a fait accompli and having no military power to resist, reluctantly confirmed Maximinus as emperor. This marked the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of nearly 50 years during which the Roman Empire would experience severe political instability, economic decline, and external threats. Maximinus was the first of the so-called barracks emperors, rulers elevated by troops without political experience, supporting factions, distinguished ancestors, or hereditary claims to the throne. The new emperor's reign began ominously. Recognizing his lack of support among the traditional ruling classes, Maximinus remained cautious and suspicious of potential rivals. He had many of Alexander Severus's close advisors killed, fearing they were plotting against him. At least 2 major conspiracies were uncovered during his early months in power, each revealing the depth of opposition he faced from the senatorial class and even from within his own military. The first conspiracy involved a plan to strand Maximinus on the hostile side of the Rhine by destroying the bridge behind him during a campaign, leaving him to be killed by Germanic tribes while the conspirators proclaimed the Senator Magnus as emperor. When this plot was discovered, Maximinus had all the suspects executed, sending a clear message about the fate awaiting those who opposed him. The second conspiracy centered around Mesopotamian archers who had remained loyal to Alexander Severus and blamed Maximinus for their emperor's death. They planned to elevate a man named Cortinus to the throne, but their leader Macedo switched sides at the last moment, murdering Cortinus and bringing his head to Maximinus as proof of loyalty. This act of betrayal did not save Macedo's life. Maximinus had him executed as well, demonstrating that treachery would not be rewarded even when it served his interests. These early conspiracies established the paranoid, violent tone that would characterize Maximinus's entire reign. Unable to trust the traditional sources of imperial support, he relied increasingly on military force and intimidation to maintain power. His treatment of potential rivals was brutal and uncompromising, creating a climate of fear that extended throughout the empire's governing classes. Despite these internal challenges, Maximinus's early military campaigns were largely successful. He began with infrastructure improvements and road construction, demonstrating some understanding of imperial responsibilities beyond mere military command. His first major campaign against the Alemanni, the same tribes that had triggered his rise to power, resulted in a Roman victory despite heavy casualties in the swampy terrain of the Agri decumates. This victory allowed Maximinus to take the title Germanicus Maximus, raise his son Maximus to the rank of Caesar and Princeps Juventutis, and deify his late wife Paulina. These actions followed traditional imperial protocols, suggesting that despite his rough origins, Maximinus understood the symbolic importance of imperial ceremony and legitimacy. Archaeological evidence suggests that Maximinus may have launched a second campaign deep into Germania, defeating a Germanic tribe beyond the Weser River in what is known as the Battle at the Hartshorn. This engagement, if it involved Maximinus's forces, would represent one of the deepest Roman penetrations into Germanic territory, demonstrating the emperor's commitment to aggressive military action against Rome's traditional enemies. After securing the German frontier, Maximinus established winter quarters at Sirmium in Pannonia and launched campaigns against the Dacians and Sarmatians during the winter of 235–236 CE. These operations were also successful, allowing him to assume the titles Germanicus and Sarmaticus in recognition of his victories over these traditional enemies of Rome. From a purely military perspective, Maximinus's campaigns were impressive achievements that temporarily stabilized Rome's northern frontiers and demonstrated the continued effectiveness of Roman arms under aggressive leadership. His soldiers, who had elevated him to power, remained loyal and effective under his command, vindicated in their choice of a warrior emperor over the diplomatic approach favored by Alexander Severus. However, these military successes came at an enormous cost that would ultimately prove unsustainable. The constant warfare required massive expenditures that drained the imperial treasury and necessitated increasingly harsh taxation and confiscation policies. Maximinus doubled the pay of soldiers, a popular move with the army but one that placed enormous strain on imperial finances. To fund his campaigns and increased military spending, Maximinus implemented policies that alienated virtually every segment of Roman society outside the army. Tax collectors began resorting to violent methods and illegal confiscations, targeting wealthy landowners, merchants, and anyone with significant property. Maximinus Thrax's relationship with the Roman Senate would prove to be his fatal weakness, a poisonous divide that would ultimately seal his doom. From the moment the Pannonian legions proclaimed him emperor near Mainz, the senators viewed him with barely concealed contempt. He was everything they despised. A provincial barbarian of humble birth who spoke Latin with a thick accent, a military strongman who had seized power through violence rather than political maneuvering. To the aristocratic senators, Maximinus represented the complete breakdown of the traditional Roman order they had spent centuries carefully cultivating. The emperor, for his part, harbored an equally intense hatred for the senatorial class. He saw them as weak, effete conspirators who would betray him at the first opportunity. His suspicions were not entirely unfounded. Within months of his accession, multiple plots emerged from senatorial circles, each one reinforcing his paranoid worldview. The first conspiracy involved a group of officers backed by influential senators who planned to strand Maximinus on the Germanic side of the Rhine by destroying the bridge behind him during a campaign. They intended to proclaim the senator Magnus as emperor once Maximinus was presumed dead at the hands of hostile tribes. When the plot was discovered, Maximinus had all the conspirators executed without mercy. The second conspiracy centered around Titus Quartinus, another senator whom disaffected troops loyal to the murdered Alexander Severus attempted to elevate to the purple. This plot took a bizarre turn when Macedo, one of Quartinus's most vocal supporters, suddenly switched sides and murdered his own candidate while he slept. Macedo brought Quartinus's severed head to Maximinus, hoping to win imperial favor through this act of treachery. But Maximinus, perhaps recognizing the dangerous precedent of rewarding betrayal, eventually had Macedo executed as well. The message was clear. Proximity to the Senate, even as an enemy, was itself a capital offense. These early conspiracies set the tone for what would become 3 years of escalating mutual hatred between emperor and senate. Maximinus ruled largely through military appointees, bypassing traditional senatorial positions and stripping many aristocrats of their wealth through confiscation and execution. He saw every senator as a potential rival, every aristocratic gathering as a breeding ground for treason. The Senate, meanwhile, chafed under what they viewed as the rule of an uncouth barbarian who had no understanding of Roman law, tradition, or governance. The emperor's decision to remain on the northern frontiers throughout his reign further poisoned this relationship. Never once did Maximinus set foot in Rome during his 3-year rule, governing the empire from military camps in Germania and Pannonia. To the senators, this was the ultimate insult. How could someone who refused even to visit the Eternal City claim to rule it? The emperor's absence became a powerful symbol of his illegitimacy, a constant reminder that he was more interested in commanding barbarian troops than governing civilized Romans. Meanwhile, Maximinus's relentless military campaigns, while initially successful, began to drain the imperial treasury at an alarming rate. His decision to double military pay had been popular with the troops, but it came at an enormous cost. The Germanic campaigns, the wars against the Dacians and Sarmatians, the constant movement of armies across the frontier regions, all required massive expenditures that the empire could barely afford. When traditional revenue sources proved insufficient, Maximinus turned to increasingly desperate measures. The emperor began systematically looting the wealth of the propertied classes, particularly targeting senators and other aristocrats. Confiscations became routine, often based on the flimsiest of pretexts. A casual remark that could be construed as criticism of the emperor, a family connection to someone who had fallen from favor, even simple wealth that attracted imperial attention could result in the complete seizure of estates and property. The emperor's agents, often crude military men with no understanding of law or precedent, conducted these confiscations with brutal efficiency. Even more shocking to Roman sensibilities, Maximinus began raiding funds that had been considered sacred and untouchable. He plundered the alimenta, the charitable funds established to feed the poor, causing widespread suffering among Rome's most vulnerable citizens. He reduced the corn dole, the free grain distribution that had kept the urban masses fed and relatively peaceful for generations. These actions struck at the very heart of the social contract that had maintained stability in the capital. Perhaps most scandalous of all, Maximinus ordered the melting down of bronze statues of gods and goddesses, along with temple treasures, to be coined into money for his military campaigns. This act of sacrilege horrified both pagans and Christians alike. Romans had always prided themselves on their piety and respect for the gods, and the sight of sacred bronze being turned into crude military currency was seen as an unforgivable violation of divine law. The emperor's persecution of Christians added another dimension to the growing hatred against his rule. Unlike previous persecutions that had been sporadic and often localized, Maximinus conducted a systematic campaign against Christian leadership. According to the church historian Eusebius, Maximinus specifically targeted Christian clergy, believing them to be the source of the religion's growing influence. The Bishop of Rome, Pontian, was exiled to the brutal mines of Sardinia, where he died under harsh conditions. His successor, Anterus, met a similar fate after only a few weeks in office. The persecution extended beyond mere exile and imprisonment. Christians were subjected to horrific tortures and public executions designed to terrorize the faithful into apostasy. Hippolytus, a prominent Christian leader, was reportedly tied to wild horses and dragged to death. Numerous Christians were thrown into mass graves, sometimes 50 or 60 bodies to a pit, without proper burial rites. The systematic nature of these persecutions, combined with their extreme cruelty, created a powerful enemy in the growing Christian community. By 237 CE, Maximinus had succeeded in alienating virtually every segment of Roman society. The Senate hated him as a barbarian usurper. The urban masses suffered from his cuts to food subsidies and his destruction of charitable institutions. The wealthy classes lived in constant fear of confiscation and execution. Christians faced systematic persecution. Even the army, his original power base, began to show signs of discontent as the constant campaigning took its toll and promised rewards failed to materialize. The breaking point came in early 238 CE in the province of Africa. A relatively minor tax dispute in the city of Thysdrus escalated into full-scale rebellion when local landowners, pushed beyond endurance by imperial tax collectors, armed their workers and clients. The provincial procurator, a particularly brutal official appointed by Maximinus to extract maximum revenue from Africa, was killed along with his bodyguards. In the chaos that followed, the crowd proclaimed the elderly provincial governor, Marcus Antonius Gordianus, and his son as co-emperors. The choice of the Gordians was inspired. Both men came from distinguished senatorial families with impeccable reputations. Gordian therefore, despite his advanced age of over 80, was known for his learning, culture, and humane governance. His son, Gordian II, was a capable military commander who had served with distinction in various provincial posts. Most importantly, they represented everything that Maximinus was not: cultured, legitimate, and respectful of Roman tradition. News of the African revolt reached Rome like lightning. The Senate, which had endured 3 years of humiliation and terror under Maximinus, saw their opportunity for revenge. In an extraordinary session, they formally recognized both Gordians as legitimate emperors and declared Maximinus a public enemy of the Roman people. This was the ultimate political condemnation, effectively placing a bounty on the emperor's head and legitimizing any action taken against him. The senatorial declaration represented a complete break with Maximinus's government. All imperial officials were ordered to transfer their loyalty to the Gordians. Provincial governors were commanded to resist any orders from the illegitimate emperor. The urban praetor was instructed to distribute weapons to the people of Rome in preparation for the city's defense. For the first time in 3 years, the Senate had found the courage to openly defy their tormentor. But the Gordians' reign would prove tragically brief. Capelianus, the governor of neighboring Numidia, remained loyal to Maximinus, possibly due to a personal grudge against the Gordian family. With the 3rd Augustan legion at his disposal, he marched on Carthage, where the new emperors had established their headquarters. The resulting battle was swift and decisive. Gordian II, despite his military experience, was killed leading his hastily assembled forces. When news of his son's death reached the elderly Gordian I, he took his own life rather than face capture. The Gordians had ruled for exactly 22 days, but their brief reign had shattered the illusion of Maximinus's invincibility. The Senate's declaration of war could not be easily withdrawn, and the psychological damage to imperial authority was irreversible. In Rome, panic set in as senators realized they had committed themselves to a fight to the death with an emperor who had already demonstrated his willingness to use extreme violence against his enemies. Faced with the collapse of their chosen alternative, the Senate took the unprecedented step of appointing 2 co-emperors from their own ranks. Marcus Clodius Pupienus Maximus, a distinguished military commander, was given responsibility for leading the war against Maximinus. Decimus Caelius Balbinus, known for his administrative skills, was appointed to handle civil governance from Rome. A council of 20 former consuls was established to advise the new emperors and coordinate resistance against Maximinus. The Roman people, however, were not impressed with the senatorial choice. Both Pupienus and Balbinus were seen as representatives of the same aristocratic class that had allowed Maximinus to rise to power in the first place. Riots broke out in the streets as crowds demanded that young Gordian III, the grandson of Gordian the Emperor, be given a role in the new government. The senators, desperate to maintain popular support, were forced to name the 13-year-old boy as Caesar, creating an awkward triumvirate that satisfied no one completely. Meanwhile, Maximinus was wintering with his army at Sirmium in Pannonia when news of the African revolt and senatorial declaration reached him. His initial reaction was characteristic: rage followed by ruthless action. He immediately began preparing his forces for a march on Rome, determined to crush this latest challenge to his authority as he had crushed all the others. The Pannonian legions, still loyal to the emperor who had elevated them to prominence, prepared for what they expected would be another victorious campaign. But this time would be different. As Maximinus's army began its march south through the Balkans and into northern Italy, they encountered something unprecedented: systematic resistance from the civilian population. Cities that had previously submitted meekly to imperial authority now closed their gates and manned their walls. The emperor's brutal reputation, his confiscations and persecutions, his destruction of temples and charitable institutions, had finally turned the entire population against him. The army's first major obstacle came at the city of Emona, which they found completely evacuated. The inhabitants had fled rather than submit to what they expected would be a brutal sack. This was psychologically devastating to the troops, who had grown accustomed to being welcomed or at least tolerated by civilian populations. Instead, they found themselves marching through a hostile landscape where every settlement viewed them as enemies rather than protectors. The real test came at Aquileia, the great fortress city that guarded the approaches to northern Italy. Under normal circumstances, the city's defenses were in poor repair, and it should have fallen quickly to a determined assault. But two senators, Rutilius Pudens Crispinus and Tullius Monophilus, had been sent from Rome to organize the defense. Working with remarkable efficiency, they had strengthened the walls, stockpiled supplies, and prepared the population for a lengthy siege. The sight that greeted Maximinus's army when they reached Aquileia must have been deeply unsettling. Instead of the quick victory they had expected, they found a city transformed into an impregnable fortress. The hastily repaired walls bristled with defenders. The nearby river provided both a defensive obstacle and an assured water supply. So there you have it, the dark and brutal end of Emperor Maximinus Thrax, a giant of a man whose reign of terror ultimately consumed him. From his humble beginnings as a Thracian peasant to his rise through military might, Maximinus proved that raw strength and cruelty could only sustain power for so long. His relentless taxation, persecution of the wealthy, and endless campaigns finally turned even his own soldiers against him, leading to his assassination outside Aquileia in 238 AD. The emperor who ruled through fear died in fear, his severed head paraded before the very troops who once followed him into battle. It serves as a timeless reminder that tyranny, no matter how physically imposing, inevitably plants the seeds of its own destruction.